All right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Father.
All right, I need a reader. It's not one of you guys. You've read before. I'm going to get Austin to read. So he's the new guy for today, so you guys come here.
Yes, sir.
So we're doing the parable today of the Good Samaritan. So go ahead and read the parable. Read it nice and loud for the recording. The mic to pick up. Just say the name of the gospel and go ahead and read the whole reading.
Luke 10:25-37. And behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered right. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by a chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, and poured oil and wine, and he set him on his own best, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise.
Thank you, Austin. Have a seat now. All right. So, thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? And I want to put a little comment box for comments, for the concerns at least.
I think this parable is really special because it's kind of a double parable, because it both highlights what you ought to do, like what God has the expectation of you to do socially, and what like loving thy neighbor means, but it also highlights what God does for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. Double parable. I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to a parable as double parables. That's interesting. So, what we're supposed to do socially, we're going to touch on that. This is an interesting word and phrase to use. But also what God does for us. So let's unpack that a little bit. So, socially, since that, Jesse says that was your word, why do you use that word socially?
Because it's the only word I could think of to refer to when you interact with another human being. Like, you can't love somebody without interacting. Well, I mean, I guess you can, but like, you can't do something loving for somebody.
What does that mean, though, in terms of this parable?
Socially.
So what is the parable? There's characters in this story, right? There's a whole build-up with this. Let's just read.
So even if
I've already unraveled it, but
Okay.
So
hold on a
even
second.
if it's
go ahead.
like someone you're not kin to, or someone you don't know, someone you have no familiarity with, you still show them kindness, grace, and how you should treat somebody.
Right. In a sense, yes. I mean, the characters in this story, I mean, Jesus is answering a lawyer who says, what should I do with those I don't particularly care for or don't know, or maybe I do know, or whatever it is, but like, what should I do to the other, right? And he gives him this scenario, this story where he says, look, there's this situation in which the circumstance presents itself where there's a man where everybody ignored that person. Right? They ignore, and it's not just anybody that they ignored, right? They're ignoring particularly an outsider. And that's why I asked the question, Jesse, like this idea of using the word socially, because in modern terms, right? Like, I mean, we would look at it and go, okay, we live in Georgia, which is a fairly conservative state in lots of ways, right? It'd be the equivalent of like, you know, bunch of people that are more conservative right-leaning, and here's a a liberal person on the side of the road with their car broken down, and everyone ignoring them because they have, I don't know, Kamala Harris bumper sticker, right? And so it's like they get ignored for that, right? That kind of level of outsider. It's an interesting thing because Jesus basically says, like, that person and you are no different, really. You're supposed to help that person, even regardless of where they come from, right? I mean, that's kind of the general gist we get out of that. It's sort of like you're supposed to help people regardless of where they line up, whether we agree with them or not, right? If we like their politics, don't like their politics, like their sports teams, don't like their sports teams, like them or don't like them in general, right? That's the idea. That's the underlying tone behind it. But I want to go a little further than that. I feel like I want to jump in on something. Go a little further.
So, all week I've been praying about how to handle a situation at work specifically. We hired a person who is a she. She's a technician. She has a wife. She is new age. She is a self-proclaimed white witch. And it's like, how do I deal with this? Because I am the lead tech at our company. I train all the new people. They ride around with me all day long. And it's...
You should remind your boss that you don't hire Slytherins and that it's a Gryffindor company. Just kidding. Anyway, keep going.
But it's kind of been like, well, how do I... And we kind of just chit-chat while in the truck and stuff. And it's... I agree with almost absolutely nothing that she believes in. And trying to make sure I still treat her with
Dignity, respect, even though
yes,
by all accounts she's everything against what you believe in.
yes,
Yeah.
And I will say we have talked about Christianity and orthodoxy, and she has been like nothing but respectful and pleasing, not pleasing, but respectful about it.
So you're leading me to my next point on this. So because you're new to the class and everything like that, the purpose of this class, at least this diving into the parables, is not to break down every single parable down to its core, because everybody and their mother has done that already. Or I should say everybody and their church father has done that. I mean, that's the better term to use, right? We're not here to reinvent the wheel and re-talk about a subject, and such like that. And there are people who are far wiser and better at it than I am. We're here to talk about how this pertains to evangelism, growth, and how we deal with those around us to help bring them into the church, right? So you're seeing this particular person who's a self-identified white witch. I don't even know which version of Wiccan that is. I assume it's
all crystals.
Okay. So not the cool kind of pagans. Like the cool kind of pagans are the Thor Hammer pagans.
Yeah. The hippie pagan.
I'd rather have the lame kind of pagans than the sacrifice kind of pagans. I think that's a little bit superior.
They're all wrong. Okay, let's just make that very clear.
There you go.
I said cool. I just said cool in the sense of at least they've got at least they're more interesting people is what I was trying to say. You don't want to look none of it's right or cool. Let's be very clear about that. But sticking back to the original point here, so you've got a coworker, right, who is essentially not an antichrist in the sense that they are the antichrist, but they're antichrist in the sense that they are everything the opposite of Christianity in their lifestyle, their beliefs, and so on. And how do you tailor to them and see them and treat them as neighbor, as understanding that they are made in the image and likeness of God, which is what this parable is telling people. Is that everybody's made in the same image and likeness of God, whether they're an outsider or someone part of your fold, right? And Christ is, essentially saying, you're supposed to help them. You're supposed to interact with them. You're supposed to basically bring them, right? You're supposed to bring them to the inn. That's the real message behind it. You're supposed to bring them to the inn and cater them. So, hold on just a second. So my question for you is, how are you... you said you talked about Christianity, you talked about Orthodoxy, and she's been very receptive to that. How are you living by that standard? Is really the question you have to ask yourself. Are you merely having conversations about it? Or is it like, does she look at you and go, yeah, Austin's, this catechumen and orthodoxy, this is the thing that he's part of, right? But is he the one who, I know if, I'm saying from her perspective, if I'm driving the truck and I get a flat tire, is he going to be the one that shows up to help? Or is it just going to be he's going to call somebody? That, you know what I'm saying? Where do you factor into that? And that's the question to ask yourself. We have to all ask ourselves in that question is, where do we factor when we're dealing with the other? Because ultimately, people see what we present. I talked about this a couple weeks ago, this idea of brand, right? If we present a brand to the world that says, oh, we're that weird ancient museum downtown that nobody knows about, or that ancient museum downtown that's out in the rural or outskirts, the suburbs of this town, right? We're just like every other little, colonial thing in some sense that people just dissociate because we're old. We're not really there's no substance to it. It's just sort of a thing to come look at and go, that's pretty, but there's nothing to it. How do we break that stigma? How do we show people that it's actually the church, that this is the church, right?
Being a good Christian.
What's that?
Being a good Christian.
But what I'm asking you is, what does that look like? How is that because you were going to say something with regards to her.
Yeah,
how do you present yourself?
She's already reported to my manager that she would prefer to ride with me versus any of the other techs we have.
Why?
Because I spend time explaining to her what we're working on. I actually invest time to show her, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why it does it, versus kind of just doing it, expecting them just to sit there, watch, pick up on it. So.
Are you doing her work for her, or are you actually?
No.
Is she actually learning?
Yeah, say we're programming a motor or something, then I will stand there with her and say, okay, now you put it into diagnostic mode. Now you scroll down, find the limits, jog the door, and have her do it and walk her through so she's actually learning.
Okay. Let's touch on that. So she's learning because you essentially guide her. So we'll talk about this idea of guiding in this sense. So how does that relate to this parable? How does this idea of guiding another person relate to this? Don't you all answer it?
I'm trying to talk. I feel like I've been talking so much.
Jason?
How does it relate?
In the terms of guiding another person.
Well, through his, I don't know how to say it, his demeanor, or how he presents himself as Christ, and how do I say this? I want to say demeanor, through his own demeanor, of how he teaches her and guides her, and how he how he acts, because he's working hard to be like Christ from the outside perspective. Well, she knows of him as a man of Christ, and how he presents himself, and how he acts, and how he actually teaches and guides her. When she leaves from his side, it's kind of his teachings and guidance lead on with her.
Okay.
Much like when this priest had helped this man who's been beaten and torn apart.
The priest didn't help.
He did not?
There's the Samaritan. The
priest
crossed to the
It was another outsider.
Oh, it was another
It was
outsider.
another outsider,
Oh,
which we were going to get into. We're going to get into in that it was another outsider because it was those who were the insiders who actually completely ignore the guy, and it's another outsider who comes and helps this outsider. That's but let me pull. We'll come back to that in a second, though. But I'm going to pick on you again, Austin, because I want to talk about this in this one sense of it, right? So, in teaching this person and guiding this person and living the faith, like Jason said, being in that trying to be that image of Christ, right, which is the right thing to do, right? How often do you talk about personal lives?
Pretty often. Her wife works in our office, and so I've learned that the lady in our office, her mom is a pastor in a family church, along with her stepdad.
You gotta have
kind of hand in hand with Pentecostal.
Okay, that helps.
Very emotional service.
When it comes to Protestantism, you have to talk to me like I'm 5. Okay? You gotta tell me a lot of these things. I'm not as versed on Protestantism as I probably should be. You know?
And so we most like.
What about your, like, I'm talking about, like, not church stuff. I'm talking about, like, personal things, like showing pictures of, does she have kids? Do they have kids together?
She doesn't, but the other lady, one that works in our office, she has 2 from her previous marriage.
Okay. I'm assuming she left a guy for this woman? You said previous
They were
marriage.
separated and then they met. Yeah, he tried to. He didn't try to. He ran her over.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, all right. What's the thing? That escalated quickly.
I guess we got personal.
Yeah. So
Okay.
personal.
But yeah, that's very personal. But you talk about like kids, right? What are you talking
And
about?
she's like into homeschooling her kids. She doesn't trust the public school for what they teach their kids. And they both are like.
You don't homeschool, right? I think you're the one.
Public,
Yeah, I think you're the one big family in this parish that doesn't homeschool. Every other family in this church homeschools. I think you're the only
It's a
one.
goal.
Which is weird because I thought you would be, but anyway, that's the other
It's
thing.
a
Right.
massive goal. But
Just gotta do it, pull the trigger.
yeah. And so, but we talk about, and they're like anti the LGBT community because they went too far left, and it's like
So there's common,
yes.
but the reason I'm asking this question is when we're talking about guiding, right, and you being that image and living with that faith.
If they feel like it.
What's that?
I did invite them to church if they feel
Okay, that's good, right? We're gonna get to that, but in the sense of it, I'm treating you right now as the other outsider, right? Because it's pretty obvious what you're doing in this situation, right? You are evangelizing to this woman or trying to talk about the gospel of this woman who has a lifestyle that we would definitely say is sinful and we don't agree with, right? And such like that. My question, going back to my question is how often are you talking about like stuff people talk about in general? Like, hey, how's your kids doing? What's going on with them? Like, how's school going? That's what I'm asking. Like, how often do we, because I think oftentimes people, like, you know, we just talk about the churchy stuff and we want to do this idea, but how, you know, like.
Yeah, she just had a surgery. She got diagnosed with something, had a surgery, and I remember because Asha, the girl in our office, was telling us about her going through it and would ask me to pray for her wife and stuff. And during this, so we talk about a lot of life and
What
personal.
about regular stuff though? Does she have a favorite team? Do you like sports at all? I can't remember what's your teams. You like some teams. You don't like any
Neither
team?
one are really sports people.
Okay. So
I'm not a
favorite,
huge.
you have a favorite movie? Do you have a favorite movie that you ever talked about? Or a favorite show?
They don't watch TV.
You sure they're the outside? Yeah. You were a kid like you age.
What's her favorite crystal? What's her favorite movie?
You don't want to ask those kind of things, but the reason I'm asking that question is like the small talk, right? That's usually like a starting point, right? People don't just like where's the starting point is really my question. The reason I'm asking this is because in the sense of it, right? Like the whole of the world, anyone outside of the church essentially is, you know, the bad and thief, right? And us out in the world, you know, we're supposed to not be the group that, you know, the Levite and the priest that ignored, right? We're supposed to be the Samaritan, right? That's the whole thing about this, right? But I'm asking you, though, in particular, and asking all of you guys to try to jump in, too, is, like, where does that start? What shows that you are representing that image of Christ? Like, in other words, what I'm trying to say is it just you talk the gospel, you talk about your faith, or what is it more than that? Because I feel like today people tend to think that the only time Christians want to, like, that the way that they convince people or have conversations with people is they have to do it through acts of debate, or serious discussion, right? Whereas, like, I give this example, right? So we have our coffee chat tomorrow. And one of the things that often happens at coffee chat is we may talk about a church thing, but most of the time we just talk about whatever, right? But sometimes we've had some things where we've gotten into, like, Father Sarah from Rose's take on aliens and demons, right? And we got into this whole thing one time. And then we switched to baseball, right? And that's it, right? Sort of, what I'm saying is like, when we preach and we talk to people and things like that, like, how much of that are we doing when we try to do a coffee chat, or how much of that are we doing by, like, let me tell you about another sense of it, like, are we like the Mormons who are like, hey, you want to hear about the Church of Jesus Christ, right? Or are we sitting there going, oh, so did you see the score of last night's Golden Knights game? I mean, that would be me. The last part, right? Well, the last 5 minutes was something else. It was tied 3-3. 5 minutes left to go, it turned into 6-3. Vegas won. I said it was bonkers at the end of it. Not like Colorado's game. I think that game ended 8-4 or something like that. That was bonkers too. But anyway, I'm going to digress, right? But how often do we talk about those things? Like, let's take it from this. Let's pull back here. Let me just change this a little bit and get us back on track, right? Because you said socially, right? Where is the biggest amount of conversation about such types of things done? Where do we have the majority of our conversations?
Society?
Social media,
Social groups, friends,
friend groups,
Work,
co-workers, right? Where do you think that most of the preaching or attempts at evangelism happens?
sidewalk.
Yeah, like street preaching.
Sidewalks? I'm talking about in our lives, like when you were in your life, like living
Us.
faith.
us.
Where are you at? If you're preaching on the sidewalk, Jason, that's great.
No.
Social media.
Social media is the biggest one, right?
Yeah.
Social media.
I mean, there's whole nicknames for groups on social media, right? Ortho Bros and I don't know if there's a Facebook one. I don't know, Ortho Bros. I guess it kind of qualifies everything. The hyperdocs, right? You get these terms,
Trad cats.
Trad, what's that?
Trad cats.
Yeah, trad casts, trad orths. I've heard about those as well.
Like Tradcast is like the counterpart to Orthobro.
I know, but I've heard trad orth as a counter to that too. A counter to the counter. I'm like, well, then why don't you just go the other name?
Yeah.
But they.
Counterculture to the counterculture.
Yeah, the counterculture. Isn't that just the culture? Point.
Double negatives go all the way back.
But we do a lot of it on the internet, right? And what do Jason, if you can remember, what do I tell you guys about that? Do you remember what I said?
You don't be like an ortho bro. You're never gonna debate.
No, that's not what I said. I didn't say don't be an ortho bro. I did kind of say that don't be an ortho bro, but why did I say that?
Why did you say it? You want me to put it in my own words?
Sure.
Why?
I mean, that's kind of what you're talking. That's why I put you on the spot.
So why don't we do that? Well, the thing is, my perception is the entire internet has their own brain in a sense, and there's nothing more that you can do to convince that person on the other side that you're right and they're wrong. Because the purpose of like Twitter or X and other social media platforms, when something that controversial comes into play, is to, well, I am right and you're wrong, and I'm going to prove that to you. So it's just constant nonsense mumbling back and forth, and it gets nowhere.
Right.
It's no personal connection to that human being at all. You don't know how their life is. You don't know how they feel. You don't know the expression on their face or the look in their eyes. You only know just the words that are on the screen. They're just the words are trying to prove you wrong. It's your own emotions attacking you. You're just reading words like it's a book.
You say your own emotions attacking you? Or their?
No, it's like
When you're reading this and you're like, I don't like what this says. The words on you're yelling at words on the screen that are causing you to feel emotion.
Battle of emotions.
Because you believe that, you perceive that as the person on the other side.
And now AI is writing it for you.
You can worse. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But you explained sort of the essence of what's being done. But I said something to you guys in that Saturday, a few Saturdays ago. I said you guys aren't what? qualified. Were you there when I said that? I think you might have been there when I said that, right? I said, you guys aren't qualified. Why did I say you're not qualified for that?
I don't have a theology degree.
That's not the only reason why. I have a theology degree, and I even say I'm not qualified for that. So what is the reason why? Why are you not qualified for that? You answered it in a weird way.
Did I?
Yes, because you're not accomplishing anything.
Yeah, I'm not getting
Right? The only ones who are qualified for are those who know how to accomplish things and have those kind of conversations and those kind of discussions, right? You said they're just words, and you're letting words be the emotions. You're letting words that you're reading, pull at your heartstrings. What you're doing is you're debating to a wall, like you said, right? And that doesn't accomplish anything, right? Conversation-wise, I can't remember who it was I was talking to about this recently. We were talking about the issue of abortion with somebody, and I said, I'm trying to remember who it was I said this to, but it was one of our other catechumens. It wasn't you guys, but it was one of them I was talking to. I said, if you're going to have the conversation on abortion, right? You can't just play the argument back and forth. You can't play their arguments at them, right? You have to take it from a non-religious standpoint with them, because what's the biggest thing that always comes back to? They always say, well, that's what your church teaches, but I'm not, you go ahead and say you're against that, but you can't tell me what to do, right? And that doesn't really accomplish anything, So what I say, I tell them, I say, fine, we're not going to have that conversation about that. I turn it back onto them, and essentially, I implore what's known as the Socratic method, which is where you make them come to your conclusion by asking them questions, in the sense of you let them work it out, right? The best professor I ever had in college, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, but he said, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think. I'm here to, and the way he did that is essentially use that approach. He helped you draw to that. He helped you think about that, right? So like the issue of abortion, for example, I will say to somebody, instead of sitting there going, abortion's wrong and here's why, here's my argument, I'll say things like, what's the purpose of life? Why does life exist? Let's talk about it from biology. Why does life exist? What's the purpose of what's the intention behind biology? What's the intention behind creatures, right? I'll say things like, what does my dog live for? Belly rubs and treats, but what does his biology tell him he lives for? What is he innately like us in every way? What's an animal, the purpose of life? And then we start talking about that, and you ask those kind of questions, and you draw them to what you're trying to do, right? And in that answer, I say things like, well, reproduction is what is ultimately, life ceases to exist when reproduction is taken out of the equation, right? When you start sitting there going, well, you know what? It's going against nature in that sense. And you draw them to this idea of how it's an act against nature. Then you can draw them to the things of God and such like that. But you start at a place in which they can be involved in the conversation. And in none of that do I have a debate with that person. And none of that do I sit there and argue with the person and go, you're wrong, I'm right. Okay? Like, for me personally, I think the only time that debates can actually even be a thing, if you really want to have the debate, is when you talk about sports. Which sounds like a silly thing to say that, right? But it's more because that's just two fans being silly towards each other, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't really mean anything. But like, you want to argue stats. Oh, so-and-so's the greatest player, here's why. That's okay. Because that's all what we call good, clean fun, But the others suck. Let's just be clear on that. Okay? What's that?
I don't know. If someone came out and said the Cleveland Browns are the best team,
I'm going to tell you right off the bat, come on, it's all let's be real. It's not the Cleveland Browns and not the Vikings, but those are the things that's okay to have a debate on, right? But when we talk about other things, more serious things, most people are not equipped to have those conversations because they don't approach it with the right effort, with the right ideas behind it. When we talked a little bit, and we kind of built up a little bit about your story, your situation with your coworker, right? I asked the question, what are you doing with that? And I liked how Jesse put that whole thing about social, right? It's an interesting kind of phrase to use because 95% of our interactions in the world are social in that sense, right? Like I asked you the question, I'm like, what do you talk about, like the things, right? How do you draw her into the church? How would you draw her into the church is the question you have to ask yourself. And you have to draw her into the places and things that like kind of open you up to it, right? And what I mean like that is you know, not saying ask her what her crystals look like. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not asking you to say what is, you know, tell me about your wife and how wonderful she is, kind of a thing, which is a very odd thing to say. You know, that's not what I'm saying as either, right? What I'm saying is how can you Socratically bring her in, right? And part of it is living your faith, right? Seeing her with this, really what this parable is about is this level of mercy. And how can you be the merciful one to them? How can you have a conversation with somebody? You know, you see this stuff right now, it's really popular, the whole change my mind thing. The same thing that Charlie Kirk did, where he would just tell people to come up and debate him, right? You know, but what was effective for Kirk was that Kirk would oftentimes try to have conversations with them more than anything, right? And how often do you see some of these guys who go out there and they do that? Most of them don't want to debate, they just want to have conversations. And you have to hear them say, I just want to have a conversation with you, I just want to have a conversation with you, you know? Because conversations are effective, and conversations make us all realize something. And what that makes us all realize is that we are essentially all the thief, the broken down, the one who's been, you know, battered and beaten, not the thief, but the one who's battered and bruised, right? That's all of us, right? And where do we get at that? So what I'm saying is where do we get to the core of that? Where are we at the very core of that in our interactions with people? Because that's what's going to draw them into the church. Right? What's going to draw them into the church is not through debate, right? It's not through our, you know, oh, I'm right, you're wrong, right? Like Jason put it, right? It's through how we live, right? You know, she sees you and you go, you're teaching her, you're helping her, you're doing that. But are you just doing that because, well, Austin's a nice guy and he does that? Are you doing that because Austin's a catechumen in an Orthodox church? Are you doing that because Austin wants to be a Christian? Like, where does she see that at? Well, she'll see that in more than just how you act, right? She wants to also, you got to show how you present, essentially, your brand to the world, right? How do you present your brand? That's what I'm getting at with this. You know, where's that level at? And then where's that conversation at? Where are you drawing her to you, right? Because the best method for winning an argument, really winning an argument, is getting them to come to the conclusion that you're right and they're wrong. And how do you do that? That's the question you have to ask yourself. That's what I'm trying to get through with all of these classes, is how do we talk to people? How do we interact with those people? How do we show them we're more than just, you know, like I said, these people that, me in my case, walking around in a black dress with a cross on, or you guys walking around with crosses on regular clothes, how do we show more than that? How do we show them that if they're on the side of the road, we may disagree with everything about them, but they know, above all else, they can count on us. You know, in my old parish, when I was in Colorado, I used to make this joke, which was kind of funny because it was an ironic joke in some sense. I used to say that other churches, if a church burned down, they would be sitting there for years trying to figure out how to rebuild it. And mine would get rebuilt in 3 days. Ironic because the fact is that church has burned down 4 times over the course of the last 100 years. Oh. So, for various different reasons. So I'd say that's kind of ironic. I make that joke and then realize that, you know, there was some truth to that more than anything, right? Sort of that sense. But this kind of notion of the salt of the earth. These are people that you knew, and people around. I had this one guy named Rob, who was a Catholic guy who used to come to our Slavic Fest. And he would come to our Wednesday morning, we would do the prayers for rain and stuff like that. And he knew the people there very well. He knew the people in Calhoun very well, the Orthodox in Calhoun. He also, when the second church, St. John the Baptist in Colorado Springs, was getting a loan that went through his bank. He owned a bank, a series of banks, very wealthy guy, nice guy. If he's listening, somehow it'd be nice if he wrote a check to us. But anyway, but you know, he used to say I'm not worried about that other church. If they're Orthodox, I can trust them because those people are legit. They will take care of their own. They will do everything they can, right? They when he wrote the loan to St. John the Baptist in Colorado Springs, he had no doubt they were going to pay that off, right? Because he's like, they are legit. They will do what they need to do. How do we give that same sort of mindset of like, people could look to us? Because people in Callahan always knew. They couldn't say this. I'm not trying to take a shot at anybody other groups there, or the other religious groups there. But they knew the Orthodox in town would take care of something if there was an issue. They would just step up and do it. Because they did that over years of just, when there was an issue, they showed up. Right? If we ever had a problem with it, when we had blizzards, right, and there were roads getting paved and such like that, like, our people would go and pave their roads of other people's roads. Our people would they wouldn't even hesitate. They would do it before they did their own. Right? And that's where I'm getting to with all this, is where are we essentially showing ourselves to be good Samaritans in this sense, to where people will just associate us with that sense of it. And that's what I'm talking about, where, effectively, we can't do that with just our words, because our words aren't going to do us, right? I talk about conversations, and how conversations are good ways to draw us when we're having conversations about faith. But it's our actions that draw people the most. You said it great when you talked about helping her out. She knows you can. What does that look like even further than that, right? Is what I'm trying to get at. How does that extend even more? And that's the question I want you guys to ask yourselves is, am I doing enough? Am I being that? Are people looking at me and going, oh, he's a very pious looking guy, but I don't trust him. Or is he I know if there's an issue, I'm the first one to volunteer. In the sense of it saying, like, I talked about this a few weeks ago in one of my sermons. I said, the biggest thing about a church is there's always the 10% that do and the 90% that do nothing, right? I can tell you right off the bat, in Callahan it was like 90-10. It was the other way around. And the 10% that didn't do anything, it was because they were old. And even the old ones tried to help, but they were too old. Some of them were too old or too broken in the physical sense, because they spent their whole life doing that, So I ask you guys, where does that look like? What does that look like for you? I'm asked the same thing to anybody else. Like, where are we examples of the Samaritan? You notice in that particular parable, right? The Samaritan at the end of that story says, whatever you spend, I'll take care of it, right? That person could have easily, if that innkeeper was a government worker, he would have drawn that bill up like crazy, But that particular, Samaritan says, whatever you do, just take care of this person, right? Where are we at that? Where are we just do it because we should do it? That's really what this boils down to. That's really what's going to be the biggest evangelism. Because having those conversations, right? You're not equipped to have those conversations, partly because I'm also not equipped, but those don't do anything. Those conversations don't do anything, right? They may answer some questions. They may spark some interest in orthodoxy from the perspective of, this is what my church is, right? But ultimately, what does Jesus say? To know you by your works, right? Or, of course, Protestants don't like when we say that, but, they'll know you by these things, right, that you do, right? If you're an example to the world, right? We're going to talk about this parable in a couple of weeks' time. I don't remember. I have to look at the outline, right? But we're going to talk about, a parable of the Last Judgment, right? And I'm just going to end this on this one thing, and then we'll leave it up to anybody else has any other comments. But in that parable, he says specifically, when I was hungry, you fed me. There is nothing to that parable that says, and here's all the conditions to it, right? In this same exact parable of the Samaritan, it's, whatever you do, I'll just take care of it. There's no conditions to it. And that's what I want you guys to think about. Is where are you doing when you're, if you're having conversations with your coworker who lives this completely different lifestyle, contrary to your own, are you helping her regardless of that? Just because you need to help her. Not because you're paid to do it, right? But you're doing it because, that's what Christ would expect you to do. And that goes with anybody else's jobs too, right? Are you doing it because you just do it? Because it's the right thing to do? Or you have conditions to it, right? If your coworker, sorry to pick on you again, Austin, which is you guys, so you get picked on most. Your coworker was not anything like that particular person, right? But was even like this very radically left-wing person, right? You know, even more so, maybe went by they, them pronouns, I don't know. Caesar, you know, what is it? Subproton pronouns, right? Whatever it is, the half pronouns, I don't know. There's some, you know, their preferred adjectives, I don't know. You know, if they were that crazy, you know, would you still help them? And the question I would assume is yes, of course. But would there be conditions? Would there be hesitancy? Would there be any kind of thing that would prevent you from, you know, would you have a second thought of, maybe not, or I will, but I'm not doing this because I want to do this. I'm doing this because I have to do this. You see what I'm saying? Like, we just do things because it's the right thing to do. And we do it because Christ did it and showed us what that mercy looks like, right? It shows us that we are supposed to just do these things, right? Because ultimately, our neighbor is made in the image and likeness of God too. And God doesn't look at any of us and go, you know what? Sorry, you're I'm gonna pick on Bree right now, right? You know, Bree. Sorry, that's Bree over there, and Bree's this type of person, and there's, you know, Luke, and Luke's this type of person, and there's Nate, who's this type of person, you know, and we're gonna classify you as 3 different types of people. I'm gonna like you more, and I'm gonna like you even more, and I'm gonna like you, well, the most, right?
That's not where I thought that was going.
Yeah, you didn't think that was going that way, right? No, God doesn't do that, right? It just happens to be that you all come from different circumstances in life, but God looks at every single one of you the same. Absolutely the same. Just like he looks at every one of those people that was in that story as exactly the same. You know, and the fathers of the church like to really dive into this idea of the image of God when it comes to this parable, how they're all seen in the image likeness of God, and that's who the neighbor is. So that's what I'm basically proposing to you is ask yourself this question of, are you doing it? Are you going to, like, how are you going to really, because if your goal ultimately is to bring them into the church, will you bring them into the church through telling them they're wrong, or helping them without any kind of chance that they may never come to the church? That's the question. Do you do it even though you know? It's a good chance. I mean, that lady, God is funny, right? You know, maybe she shows up and one day and her changes her entire life. Maybe she turns into a monastic, or maybe they divorce and live separately, or they live as a sister and sister. That's weird, but you know, right? They live apart, whatever it is, right? Maybe that happens, maybe they never do, you know? But where do you factor into that? Do you still do it anyway? Do you still show her that same level of compassion regardless? That's the question to ask yourselves. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then let's see. What are we looking at time-wise? We're about. Do you have any questions on that? And then we'll go ahead and do a couple of questions afterwards. Otherwise, I'll stop the recording. Any questions on that? No?
I think, well, I had a couple
Or comments too. Yeah, sorry. You can comment.
I think the parable is particularly interesting because of the choice of the Samaritan, because not only was the Samaritan considered an outsider, but like an actual enemy of the Jewish state at that point, where it's like these are like the guys who vow religion, but they're complete heretics. You know, in other passages, when the Pharisees are harassing Jesus, they'll be like, "Oh, you're a Pharisee. You have a devil in you." You know what I mean? Is that like they legitimately thought like you're a Samaritan. My bad. You're a Samaritan. You have the devil in you. Mm-hmm. They legitimately thought these Samaritans were like evil, but they were just basically the same kind of people, but they couldn't worship on the same mountain.
Yeah.
You know.
They didn't just see them as evil. They saw them as less than human.
Yeah, like subhuman.
Like subhuman, and that's the problem, right? Like, this is why St. Paul specifically says there's neither, Jew or Greek, master or slave, all are made in Christ, right? To bring home the point, every single person is made in the image and likeness of God, right? And every single person, this idea, you need to get this idea out of your head, I'm not saying you personally, I'm saying maybe you get this idea in your head. They are, you may have differences of opinions, you may have differences of your background, but the bottom line comes down to it is guess what? You're all the same in my book. That's what Jesus is saying. You're all the same.
It's ironic because wasn't the Samaritans like the first to actually buy into Jesus as the Messiah? Especially Saint Fotini?
I mean, I wouldn't say they were the first in particular. I mean, there were lots of different people that interacted.
Well, I mean, like the
she's
first massive group, like people. Like the Samaritans subscribed to Christianity before most of the other Jews did.
I mean,
in a way.
Particular individuals, yes, but I wouldn't say the entirety of Samaria was all on board, kind of a thing.
So what happened to them? Because if the Jews considered them subhuman, if they didn't want to subscribe to Christianity, where'd they go?
But this is the thing though, right? So the Jews who converted to Christianity, while they saw themselves as Jews in some capacity, they also, like you see in Acts, they were the first ones to call themselves Christians, right? They name changed. They relocated their franchise, if you will. Okay. They got to. In that sense, they stopped utilizing this idea of their ethnic attachment to it and started utilizing this idea of their Christian attachment to it, because they started to realize, the early Christians realized this, and to this day Orthodox Christians preach this same thing, which is there is no, although you'll see this and say, well, what about these groups? I said, those are ethnic groups that have said that because of various reasons, but that's not how the church actually is built and operates. This idea that, your Christian identity has no ties to an ethnic group. Right. Now, I know, of course, you could say, well, what about groups like the Greek Orthodox, who will say,
there's a bunch of ethnic
that they say they're very ethnic, right? Or Russian Orthodox, or Serbians, or Romanians, right? There are some of that, right? But ultimately, the faith itself does not subscribe to that.
Yeah.
Which is why you're seeing, over the last 20, 30 years, that's gone away, because that worked when there was a time in which it needed to be, because people were scared. And I'm going to talk about that actually in a few weeks when we do the next young adult class when I take over for the class. I'm going to talk about this idea of what the church's structure is and how it works, why are there different jurisdictions in America, that whole fun class and everything like that. So I'm going to address that more, but I will say this now is the whole idea behind the identity of the Jews back then to now, right? They still saw themselves as having Judaism, the Jewish side of it, but they didn't attach the ethnic side to it as much as or rather I should say, the ethnic side of it was just part of their identity, but it wasn't what they really were, right? In some sense, you could call them Jewish Christians, which there are groups today, like the Messianic Christians, who call themselves that, right? Who try to attach that because they want to be like the early Christians, but those early Christians separated themselves from that very quickly, because for them it was all about Christ, right? The term of calling themselves Christians back then, right, was mostly a term that was being utilized because they were part of the faith of Christ, and that they were being referred to by the government as the faith of Christ. But for them, they were just thinking it's just, I'm part of Christ. They weren't attaching themselves to a team like they used to attach themselves to. So it wasn't so much that other groups were the first one to do it. It was anybody who was an early Christian of any kind of group very quickly detached themselves from those old ways in that sense. Did they lose their culture and their traditions and the worship? No, actually the Jewish worship was continued on, as you can see today in Orthodoxy, right? But it was no longer, in the sense of it, and this is my biggest gripe with Judaism, okay, and I'm just going to say this, and this is not meant to cause a kind of stir or anything, I'm just going to say this for the sake of helping explain this, right, is that too many people today attach Judaism solely to ethnicity. That one can be an atheist Jew. In reality, you could never be an atheist Jew. Because a Jew by nature says that God exists, and that you are part of this special covenant, this special group of people. An atheist Jew cannot exist. Because how can you say that you're part of some special group, but that group doesn't believe in anything?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense, right? Or the same thing equivalent of someone saying that they are a secular Jew, right? To me, it's just like, how can you be a secular Jew? You either believe in what the state, or you believe in what Judaism teaches, and those two may work at times together, but most of the times they contradict themselves. Because at the core of it, right? Don't you just worship God? Doesn't it matter what you do to get to God? That you can be with God? Now they have a different view of what that means, right, than we do. They see the world differently, and that's not what I'm talking about in particular. What I'm talking about is identity in that. Where's your identity on that? And ultimately, your ethnicity means nothing. And the early Christians didn't look at their ethnicity as the big underlying thing. They didn't hold that attachment, because Jews today will justify that you could be a secular or an atheist Jew, because they can say, well, there's the ethnic side, they go hand in hand, right? Whereas a Christian can't do that, because ultimately we have no, like I say to people all the time, I don't have a political party. Yes, I might be registered under one of them, right? Or may not be. Actually, I'm a registered independent, but I might lean towards one particular political party, but honestly, my political party is the kingdom of God. That's the only party I care about. A friend of mine on Facebook posted yesterday, he said, my political party is this, and he posted Psalm 103. That kind of thing, that type of stuff. I'm the same way, right? Like, whatever expands the kingdom of God is my political party, because I don't care about that. And that's what Christians are supposed to see, right? So this, I know we're going on a tangent here, but it's an important thing to look at it as. It's not so important that one group or another group was the first to identify themselves in that sense. It's do they identify themselves with the right group?
Yeah.
The right group is, or rather I should say, do they identify themselves with any identity at all? Because we don't have an identity in any ethnic group. We have an identity in Christ.
Yeah.
Right? We are all called to be little c Christ in that sense, right? That's why in the early church they refer to Paul calls all of the Christian saints, right? Nowadays we actually canonize the saints and have changed that terminology and such like that, where we don't just call everyone, right? Because back then when they used the word saint, they meant one who's striving to be holy, whereas today now we say one who's already holy.
Yeah.
So it's a little different in that sense, because we put more terms and stuff like that.
I think if I had to reword what Paul was saying, is that he was trying to say is that we all have the capacity to become saints. It sort of ties into the whole theosis.
He does. I mean, I'm not saying that.
No, I know.
In that sense, but anyway, good comment, good question. Any others? And then we can... No? All right, let's pray and then we'll do a little Q&A. It is truly meet to bless you with Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure Mother of our God. More honorable the chair and more glorious God compared to the seraphim. Without the Father, you gave birth to God the Lord. True Theotokos, you magnify you. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.